Morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion. Creating a culture of performance or well-being, and is it possible to have both? When we look at well-being, most of the stats refer to employee engagement, and according to Gallup, the state of employment or global workforce, only 15% of employees are engaged in the workplace. When we start to look at this, 33% of the US employees are engaged in the workplace, and that's almost twice the amount on the global average. On the other hand, in Western Europe, only 10% of employees are engaged at work. However, the UK, it's a little bit more alarming. Only 8% of the UK workforce is actually engaged in its workplace. And that number has been declining for quite a number of years. So it's not looking good on that sort of front. According to new research, though, for over 600 US companies of between 50 and 500 employees, 63.3% of companies say retaining their employees is actually harder than hiring them. And companies with a highly engaged workforce claim to be 21% more profitable than others. However, we're not there. A recent Interact Harris poll showed that 91% of employee surveys think their leaders lack communication skills. And what was worse, almost 1 in 3 employees don't trust their employer at all, according to the Elderman Trust Barometer, whatever the Elderman Trust Barometer is, but we'll work that one out. In a long-term study, and this is a very long-term study, so this is quite an interesting one, companies that had the best corporate culture that encouraged all-round leadership, initiative, highly appreciated their employees, customers, and owners, grew by 682% in revenue. And during the same period of time that they did the evaluation over, which was 11 years, so this has got to be something that we can really look at, companies without a thriving corporate culture only grew by 166% in revenue. So that means a thriving culture is almost 4 times higher in growth revenue than a normal culture. One study asked what would be the most important thing a manager or a company could do to help their employees to be successful, and 37%, which was the majority, cited recognition as the most important method of support. And other solutions were 12% was autonomy, 12% for inspiration, 7% for more pay, 6% for more training, and 4% for promotion, meaning that a third of the workforce first and foremost needed encouraging before they actually did anything else. And according to the survey of rewards and recognition, 43% prefer to receive recognition privately on a one-to-one with a manager, where only 10% wants to receive recognition publicly in front of their peers, and 9% would prefer recognition privately in written form. Wow, written form. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, 75% of employees say they feel more socially isolated. 57% said they are feeling greater anxiety, and 53% feel they feel more emotionally exhausted. And that came to the Harvard review. And one of the reasons why they feel emotionally exhausted is because during the pandemic, employees worked up to 3 hours a day more than on average before. And that came from Bloomberg. So if you think about driving to work, driving home from work, lunch hours, those sort of all disappeared. 86% of employees say they feel that they need to prove to their boss that they are working hard in order to deserve to keep their job. That's a real interesting stat. 86% of employees feel that they need to prove to their boss that they are working hard. So where is all the trust in the world, I suppose, on that question? So today I'm joined by Dave and Paul. Heather is training a client somewhere down in the big smoke. So Mr. Jacobs did say to me, quite as he was brandishing his new head razor, because he's shaved his hair, or that one hair that he had on his head. He said, please don't come to me with the first question, because I've not read the first question. I've no idea what the first question is. So I won't be coming to you, Paul. But Paul, employee well-being has become the new workplace sort of term since COVID. Yeah. So in your view, what does that actually entail?
You can go off people, Howard.
We can only hope.
I think, look, this entire subject of employee well-being is something I think every business owner and director is well aware of now. Your quotes just now, I think, summarize that very well. The truth is that, being aware of the mental well-being of your people has never been more important. And there's no question at all that I think people have found it extremely difficult to adapt to what this new world of work looks like. People I speak to are back at work, getting back to work, don't want to be back at work 5 days a week, want to be back at work 2 or 3 days a week maximum. Other people have got very used to working from home and are not particularly interested in going back into the office a great deal at all. And therefore, being aware of the mental health of your people is entirely relevant at the moment, particularly at the point where I would say, and maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but I think the power of lies in the hands of employees now. There are a lot of jobs out there, and people have choice. If they're unhappy in their work and they don't feel that they're being looked after in every respect, they will vote with their feet. The power lies with employees, it seems, not employers at the moment. We know that as recruiters, and you can see that with your client base, but you can also see it with the people that work within the businesses. If they're unhappy, they don't feel they're being cared for, they don't feel valued, they will leave, and they'll find jobs that match their aspirations and people who take perhaps better care of them. So there are some important points here. So, as you asked the question, has employee well-being in the workplace since COVID, what does it actually entail? It entails getting close and close and closer to your people, particularly when they are working in a remote fashion, either full-time or part-time. Getting to know them, not just from a work perspective, but on a personal basis, is critical. It is critical.
Dave?
Yeah, I was smiling when you said how the 8%, only 8% of the UK workforce were engaged. I was thinking that's probably because they couldn't be bothered to fill out the survey. which is a problem in itself. But the thing is, well-being, we all know, and I think the one thing, as Paul said, we all know that well-being absolutely matters, because if you're not engaged, if you're not well, if you're not performing, then engagement is going to be low. There are kind of 5 areas really for well-being. I know a little bit about this only because of my involvement in the mental health charity Made for More. But the key things are giving people the opportunity to connect with other people, giving them the opportunity to be healthy themselves as well, physically healthy, which of course we saw a big downturn anyway, didn't we, with everybody working from home. People want to learn new skills. But the two things that don't come up very often, but I think are really important in the whole well-being debate, are people given the opportunity to give to others, to give back, to do something for somebody else. That creates enormous well-being and enormous engagement. And then the other thing is just paying attention to what is going on right now. So often, don't we? We all do this. We're all looking at the future. We're looking at next week. We're looking at targets and actually what's going on right now, today. So, as employees, as employers, if we can get those things right, then we're going to have a more engaged workforce.
It's interesting when I start to think about this. I think there's 2 things that should sort of determine well-being. One's being appreciated for your endeavour, which should include trust and being trusted by your employer. And I think that 86% of employers feel they need to prove to their boss that they're working hard, sort of shows how unbalanced our well-being sometimes is. And the other one is being able to actually switch off. And I think that sort of being able to switch off from work is really important. I think the French brought in, haven't they, that you can't email after a certain time at night, and you can't email your employees when they're on holiday and things like that. So it means that people have to get switched off.
But they're always on blooming strike anyway, so I don't think they do any work, do they?
But what we've got to think about is when we start thinking about that, being able to switch off and being able to do the right things, it is that personal fitness and that personal well-being. And I find it incredibly hard to switch off at night and find sleeping really hard. And one thing I noticed when I went to Australia, I was playing pro sport in Australia, so I wasn't working, I was getting paid to play pro sport, is that you had a lot more time to sleep. And the more I slept, the better I felt. And the better I felt, the better I played. But it was the fact that I was being able to switch off. And I think a lot of people just can't switch off. Therefore, it's forever turning over in your mind what you're doing. And I was sort of thinking about what have I just done the day before? What have I done today? And what am I doing tomorrow? It's always going on in my head. And therefore, sleep was a real problem. And I think, when I went on holiday a couple of weeks ago, again, that switch off and that being able to sleep massively changed my sort of well-being. So I think we've got to start to think about as well-being is not just about in the workplace, but outside the workplace, and what impact that has on the person and their lifestyle outside the workplace. We talk a lot, though, about performance, and we know in a performance culture, because it's very KPI driven, how we measure performance. So how do we measure performance then in a culture of well-being?
I said this a moment back. You have to be consistently talking to your people, getting close to them. And I don't think it's just about their physical performance in the business. We're pretty good at that generally in recruitment. We measure metrics, we measure ratios. We have that lovely expression, KPIs. I think most businesses are pretty good at measuring the inputs and indeed the outputs of people. I think if you really want to understand how to measure people, there has to be more depth to it. Can't just be about measuring productivity. You have to measure the way people are feeling about working in your business, feeling about working with others in the company, their feelings about the economy, and their issues, if they have any, or challenges they have in their personal lives. How you measure performance is much more 360 than it's ever been. I think pre-COVID, we'd have an interest in some people and their backgrounds and what they were doing outside of work. But generally speaking, our engagement with those people was based almost purely on what they were doing in work. And on what I think is now important is to understand holistically, how are people overall? And if you're measuring performance, then you should be measuring how they're feeling, not just about their work, but also about their lives as well. Now, there is a limit, clearly. We are employing and engaging people in our business, and there's some things that people don't want to discuss, and neither should they be pressed to talk to you about those things. They have private lives. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be trying to understand the drivers that people have inside and outside work, and understand what's going on in their lives to the extent that you can then provide to them a level of support and guidance that perhaps pre-COVID you wouldn't necessarily have got involved in. So I think when you're talking about measuring performance, you really can't look at it purely from what happens when as it were, when they walk into work in the morning, and then from that point up to when they leave in the evening. You've got to be much more interested in them as a human being. So measuring, I think, comes down to getting closer to people. It's around performance reviews. I don't like that expression. It's about weekly conversations, one-on-one meetings. It's about quarterly reviews that relate not just to work, but also to their performance and what's going on in their personal lives and so on. So I think you should be reviewing every method of communication that you have with that individual and understanding more about them as a human being than you presently do, if that's the case and you aren't doing it presently.
Yeah, I think all of that. I mean, I think everybody on this webinar will have their own ways of measuring performance. I think for me, if I'm a leader of a team of people that are performing or not, a couple of really vital questions like, how are you? How are you feeling? And the key one for me about performance and well-being that connects the two is, how happy are you in your work? And it's the bit that sometimes we forget to ask, because I don't know, for example, that I have ever seen a review form, a performance review form with that question on it. How happy do you feel today? How happy are you in your job? Because it will evoke an answer that will then probably lead to a number of different questions that won't necessarily be related to how many CVs you've got out, how many video interviews have you done, how you're getting on managing your team of contractors on site, or how many permanent placements have you made. All of the stuff that we all need to know from a day-to-day basis, but people can be utterly miserable and still be performing. And they're the ones that aren't engaged. people can be earning a lot of money because they're doing well, but still be very, very unhappy.
Mm.
So I think those two questions, how are you today and how happy are you in work, the answers to those can help us determine whether our culture is making our people happy.
It's interesting, isn't it? 1 in 3 employees don't trust their employer, which sort of says that when you start to think about that well-being, that's a real big problem. If you start to think about that and say if a third don't trust their employer, a third sort of are in between and it could go either way, and a third are well engaged, that means only a third of your workforce is engaged properly into your business. So that measuring well-being is really important. And I remember sort of speaking to a company during lockdown, and one thing that they brought in was a weekly well-being meeting with each member of their staff, and that was a meeting to talk about them and not to talk about performance, but just purely to talk about them. And they said that has massively helped their attrition. It's lowered their attrition hugely because people feel that they are engaged and feel that the actual business actually cares about what they're doing, because the conversation they have is not about performance. It is about them and about how they can help them. And I think that measuring their well-being is really a hard measure to make. You know, how do you grade between 1 and 10 whether someone's really engaged or not? You know, you've got to have that trust for them to be open and honest with you before you can start to measure it properly. But if we look at the stats that we're getting from people like Bloomberg and, you know, Harvard Business Review, etc., if that is correct, if 1/3 is already disengaged, if you could just only save 10% of that, can you imagine what that has on your retention rate? Can you have on your business performance? It will start to grow. So that making sure people are happy, in inverted commas, at work is really important, and that well-being then therefore needs to be a measure somehow, but needs to be part of the reviews that you have on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, and probably needs to be separated out, I think, from a performance review, which is a different review. I think you can't put performance and well-being in the same review, because I think you're going to conflict with each other if you do so from there. So one of the questions that we're asked all the time is about how we grow strategy. And if you remember right, the famous Peter Drucker wrote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So the question is, do we need to view our strategy to ensure it has a more culture focus in it, to ensure that we are growing a culture and not just growing performance?
Well, the answer to that is completely yes. I mean, you had a slide a moment ago, Simon Sinek, who I think most people have watched on TED Talks. There you go. And here's his statement, and I think it answers the question very well. If you hire people just because they can do a job, they'll work for your money. But if you hire people who believe what you believe, they'll work for you with blood and sweat and tears. And I think that's entirely true. People will literally, if you can engage their hearts and minds in your cause, in your project, in what you're trying to achieve. And I'm not talking about hitting profit targets or hitting turnover targets and margin targets. All those things, of course, are important. But if you're talking about the purpose, the why, as he talks about, because he talks about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And that applies, I think, very much to the people that work in your business. So engaging people's hearts and minds in your company will get them to a place where they will literally walk through walls for the purpose of the business. They believe completely and fervently, fanatically even, about what the business is doing. And you can see that in many organizations. We often make reference, as he does, Simon Sinek, to Apple. But not many businesses are Apple. You can still create a most amazing culture in a very small business. And in fact, I would argue very strongly that creating a fantastic, engaging culture in a smaller business is somewhat easier than in a large corporation, because with a small number of staff, it's very easy or easier to really envelop people in what you're trying to achieve, and on a moment by moment basis, constantly recount the mantra that what is important to your business, where you're going. We do have a tendency in our industry, and again, it's completely understandable, to focus every conversation on KPIs and metrics and how many interviews we've arranged, or how many temps we have out, or contractors working, and margins and our profit margins and all the business stuff. And we do it all the time, and that's, as I say, completely understandable. It's what pays the bills, and it's hopefully creating the profits. But if that's the only focus, if that's the only conversation, you have a fairly mono method of engaging people, and that isn't an engaging method of engaging people. People want to work in a business where they feel completely engaged by the culture of it. And it's often why we talk about some of the more peripheral elements. You know, these days people are interested in working for businesses that are, for example, engaged and interested in corporate social responsibility or DE&I, for example. These aren't flippant subjects. These are things that are very important to people. So really understanding your why, which is what Simon Sinek often talks about. If you haven't watched his TED Talk, then I'd urge you to do so. But the why is so important. And if you get people to understand why you are in business and why you get up every morning, and they understand why candidates and clients should want to work with your business, then you're a long way forward to creating a culture that people are utterly engaged in and will want to work in for many, many years. If you fail to do that, then as he says, you'll have people that will work for the paycheck and they'll do the job you ask them to do, but they'll never be engaged hearts and minds with your business. And you will have a business that I'm afraid turns over staff, has a pretty high attrition rate. You have to work on the culture.
Yeah, I mean, culture is so vital, as we know. I remember taking over an office in Germany where the manager used to get in early to shake hands with every employee as they came into the office. And he very proudly did this. And I thought this was nuts. Just be nice to them during the day. They don't need to be greeted. And we had a real debate about the culture, and you know, was I, being the Brit, coming over, changing the culture of the way he ran the office? But actually the culture in that office was totally driven by that one person, by his attitude, by his beliefs, and there was nothing from the floor. And the staff didn't particularly like it, didn't care for it. They just wanted him to behave differently and manage differently. And I think that's the important thing, is if people are interviewing for your company, the questions they should be asking, or the key question, strategy is absolutely vital. Where's the business going? What's the purpose? How's it going to get there? What's my role in it? But actually, one of the key questions I'd ask is, what is it actually like to work here? Yeah, little things. Can you eat your breakfast at your desk before you start work? Does the boss mind if you're a few minutes late back from the gym at lunchtime? Are you allowed to go to the gym at lunchtime? Is there flexi work? All of those things are the actual bit of what's it actually like to work here. And that's the culture. And if the culture fits with the way that you live your life and you run your life, then you're going to perform better. And therefore the business is going to perform better. So I think that's really important in terms of measuring it.
Typical Brit Dave Pye. God, we don't need to shake people's hands.
Easy.
We mustn't show any empathy or warmth. Good grief.
And the reason why, the interesting thing, Paul, on that was that he had come from a chemical engineering background, German company in Brazil, where that's what they did.
I think what it is, it shows that the manager, I'm first in, and therefore you must be in on time. I think that, to me, that I'm going to wait and greet you and shake you by your hand, so therefore you must be on time. So I think there's two sides to that conversation.
Yeah. But to me, I've equally had people who have a little black book by their desk, and they've noted when people have left.
Yeah, which is odd. I looked at this and I started thinking, I needed to find a quote that went with it. And I came across this John Quincy Adams quote, which, if actions inspire others to dream more, learn more and do more and become more, then you're a leader. And to me, that sort of summed up, culture and summed up what's going on. And this is a guy that was, I think he was the 6th president of the USA.
That's my dad, by the way. That's not John Quincy Adams. That's my dad.
Steady. So, but what we're saying is, though, that culture then starts to drive the strategy and makes the strategy come to life. And I think if you can have a really good strategy, but you have no culture, then your strategy is doomed to fail. But if you have a really good culture and a really strong strategy, then you're going to be almost invincible to a certain degree. And I think when you start to focus very heavily on culture and making sure people are happy, because the next question we'll find out what we think on that, whether people are happy, it makes performance. And I think once people become a little bit more, they feel trusted. If you go back to looking at how people feel and how they need to feel safe and they need to feel warm within a business and within their life, so they perform better. And so if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all of those things are all about the things that create culture, not the things that create strategy. And to me, it's about making people feel safe, making people feel welcome, making people feel that this is somewhere they can blossom. And once they feel that they can do that, then they start to perform, irrespective of what you're saying, because they perform by their own needs, because they feel safe enough to perform. And that goes back to that age-old flight and fight fantasy that people have in their heads. But every 5 seconds, I think every 5 times a second, that's what your brain's telling you, to fight or flight. Now, if that doesn't ever kick in because you feel safe, then you will perform because you're not worried about other things. So the next question then, and I want a simple yes, no answer to the first point. Are employees or happy employees more productive? So I want a simple yes or no answer to that bit, followed by, considering all the evidence, why do employers find it difficult to read the room to see if their employees are happy or not?
So the answer is yes. And I think if you're asking the question, why do you think employers find it difficult to read the room to understand if employees are happy or not? In our industry, I would argue that that's because we often find ourselves in a very reactive situation. There's a huge amount going on every day, 1,000,001 things to attend to. And particularly if it's a small recruitment business and you're very actively involved in billings, you're interviewing candidates, you're arranging interviews, you're dealing with temp contract opportunities, 1,000,001 other things to deal with in running a business. The truth is that you're not necessarily finding the time to lift your chin off the desk, to look around you and understand how people are feeling. But again, I think it's entirely understandable. It's an incredibly busy environment, which is the reason we love it so. But if you don't take the time to breathe in the course of a day, and as to Dave's earlier point about going around and spending a bit of time with everybody, then you can't possibly hope to understand how people are feeling. So the yes is the answer. Of course, happy employees are far more productive, but at the same time, it's, I think, entirely important to recognize as a leader that you have to spend time. It's an integral part of your day to understand how people are feeling. And that means nothing more difficult than spending a bit of time with everybody.
Yeah, I think yes is the one-word answer. I don't think it's necessarily about reading the room, it's about reading the seat. Because I think if you read the room, you get a view that everybody's happy, or some people are happy, or some people aren't. And actually the unhappiest people perform best in a room of lots of other people, because they're hidden, because they don't get seen. What people need to do, what we as leaders need to do, is read the seat. Actually sit down one-to-one with that person and ask them the questions that we've all just been discussing. Because then what you do, you end up building up a whole formula of actually how are those people. So those really unhappy people may be performing quite well, sitting in a room with lots of other loud people, and they're kind of invisible, and that's the way they like it. But it doesn't mean they're happy. I know my experience of mental health and working with people is it's so easy to disguise whether you're happy or not. And it's only when you ask and somebody takes the time to invest in you, and to your point earlier, Anne, about building trust. And you just by asking the question doesn't mean you get trust. That's something that's built over time. And if you can keep your employees long enough to show them that you care, to show them that you are a trustworthy person, to show them that your business is trustworthy, then you've got a really good culture. And they'll tell you the things that you want to know as a business leader.
So to that question, and what you're saying, Dave, is it's not just about asking the question. It's about continually asking the question, but asking the question from the right position, not from just asking the question. You've got to actually mean it, and you've got to actually want to know listen to what the answers are, and then understand. And that goes back to that thing, because I say absolutely happy employees are definitely the most productive employees. And I think when we talk about that and we start to look at that, that trust will only come when your employee is happy to open up about their personal life, their work life, etc. And you've got to listen as a leader to what they're saying, so you can actually understand how you can interact with them. Because sometimes it's not about performance, sometimes it's not about work, sometimes it's about doing the right things for that person in their home life. Because obviously whatever we say, you can leave your home life at the door when you come into work and just get on with it, it's your safe space, but it's almost impossible to do sometimes. And I think what we've got to think about is that trust, and that trust has to be built over an awful long period of time, and therefore we've got to work on that. It's interesting that we all agree that you have certain people who are unhappy that hide in high productive environments, but you also have people who are unhappy in low productive environments. But also what you have is some of those people might be the people that will then become your, as we described it right back in the early days of COVID, the terrorist within your business who's chipping away at the infrastructure of your business. So if one of your 1 out of 3 who's unhappy in your business is chipping at the 66%, then that 33% grows because they start to jump on that bandwagon. And we all know that a negative comment is 5 times more powerful than a positive comment. So sometimes addressing the negative people within the business is really important, and finding out who they are, because they're the ones that could be creating the undercurrent within the business. And therefore not reading the seat or not reading the room is really important, because if you're not reading the seat or the room, it says that you're not listening to what your business is actually saying to you about your business. So next question, if you're going to change to a culture of well-being, in your view, what's the most critical thing you need to change at the beginning?
The answer is listening. You have to move to some degree away from telling to listening.
Well, did he say hard?
I didn't hear what you said there, Paul.
Say again? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
We were just joking with you.
I know you're joking. Just so it's about listening, isn't it? It's about making sure that you're finding the time to sit and talk to people and listen to what they're telling you. Now, I think listening is a twofold thing. You alluded to this point, Howard. It's not just listening to words; it's understanding body language, and really being aware of how people look and feel. Not everybody's good at articulating their feelings, but you can often understand how they're feeling simply based upon their body language and their general demeanor. Also, people will tell you how colleagues are feeling, not necessarily about themselves. They'll remark on how they see others around them. It's very often the people that work with you that know more about the people that work in the business than perhaps you do. So again, it's about listening, but it's making the time to do that. And some of that, as Dave was alluding to earlier, is about daily things, simple human interactions, sitting down, talking to somebody, having a cup of coffee, grabbing a sandwich with somebody, going out occasionally for a drink, but just getting to know people, having a chin wag with people in the office, being there, being present, being in the moment. It's also about the processes you put in place, those reviews that I've talked about. It still surprises me when I talk to recruitment businesses that they, for example, will only sit down once a week and have a team meeting, where I've always personally said, especially in offices of a certain size, you should be having 3 meetings a day. The morning discussion, the lunchtime catch up, the end of day mop up, and then the once a week one-to-one discussions where you can have a private conversation with an individual and a training session every week. There's a never-ending level of communication, let alone quarterly performance reviews, annual appraisals, and so forth. We should be really good at this. I mean, we are an industry that is all about communication. We do a brilliant job in communicating with candidates and clients. Maybe it's something we need to be looking at internally. How well do we communicate internally? And as I said at the beginning, it's not just verbal communication, it's using your eyes as well as your voice and your ears.
Dave?
I think the question is a brilliant one, and I think to Paul's point, absolutely listening is vital. If I were a leader running a recruitment business now, I would ask that question to each of my staff. What do you think we could do better? Because it goes to engagement, it goes to culture, that you're happy to engage and ask your staff. Some people, I mean, I even in the last month or so, I've been with a recruitment leader who didn't want to ask his staff certain questions because he didn't know what to do with the answer, and was afraid a little bit that if they said what he thought they were going to say, he'd have to change the company. And it was really bizarre, because it's like, well, surely you need to know, because otherwise they're sitting on something that could be really important, could be really vital, but also it builds engagement and it builds trust. So that's today.
Do you think, Dave, do you think that talks to whoever this person is, their own insecurity? Because, I mean, we're talking here, and it's an interesting point you raised, because we're talking here about listening to people. What we haven't discussed is the attitudes of the people that run the businesses, that, you know, are leaders, are owners and so forth. Maybe, and you touch on an interesting point, maybe sometimes what you don't know is can't harm you is a kind of attitude that certain people have. They don't really want to know what's going on around them because actually they're feeling fairly insecure about it all.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So it's interesting when I wrote the question. Obviously, I wrote the question, and then you have got to think of the answer afterwards. You know, listening sort of came in, but my first view was, what's the first thing I'd change? The beginning to change would be to understand myself better and know what I wanted, what were my true values, what is it I want to get from the business and drive the business. Because once I know that, then I can go out and find out whether I'm actually delivering that back to my staff and whether they're delivering it out to the candidates and the clients from there. So to me, the first thing when I change a culture of well-being is, am I living up to the culture that I've created? And if that culture needs to change, am I listening to the people, therefore I can change it? So the first thing I was looking at was me, which is a really interesting segue, Dave, because I didn't know what your answer was going to be. But you've got a leader there that is frightened of hearing what people are going to say, because it might mean that he has to address himself. And that's sometimes the most fearful thing, is to sort of look in the mirror and say, you know, are you my friend? Are you not my friend? Type scenario. And that to me would be the first thing. If I was going to address the culture of well-being, I'd address what my view of well-being is. What does my view of well-being look like? And does that sit with the rest of the people's well-being? And I'm going to be sat there thinking, well, looking at those companies that have a high productive business that's based on the well-being of their staff, etc., if they are genuinely 4 times more productive from a gross profit point of view, then I should be thinking, I need to change. And that's the bit that I would change, is me. I need to change. And that sort of pulls into the next question, is a thriving company culture leads more than 4 times the higher revenue of growth. So why aren't leaders addressing this? But following on from our last question, what else should we do to change in order to address this and actually create a high revenue growth business based on well-being?
I mean, look, I think you're touching on some very interesting points here. Work shouldn't be a bad place to go to. You know, there is no reason that anybody, or very few reasons in our industry particularly, why people should be miserable at work. And it is entirely contingent upon us as leaders to make sure that people are really happy at work. And let's be clear, you know, there isn't a recruitment consultant alive that hasn't had bad weeks, bad months, even bad years. I mean, anyone that says they've always been successful is a liar, basically. The truth is, we kind of erase the bad days, the bad weeks, the bad months from our minds. We remember the good stuff. But everybody has these ups and downs. It's part and parcel of what goes on in our industry. Nevertheless, despite the fact that, you know, to use that cliche, it's a roller coaster of emotions, work should be a fun place to be in. And frankly, given what we do for a living, dealing essentially with the human race, there's never a shortage of things that should keep us engaged or even amused. And being at work is a very important thing. Being happy at work, enjoying work, working with people who share your values, who share your morals, if you like, is entirely important. And we know that people will work in businesses for less pay than they can earn elsewhere if they love the company they work for, if they love being at work, love working with the other guys, and they feel completely engrossed by the work, but more importantly, engaged by the culture. And if you've got a happy workforce, if you have people that love working in the business, they will perform brilliantly for you, as we've said earlier. It's not a surprise to me that that stat comes up. Thriving company cultures leads to more than 4 times higher revenue growth. That doesn't surprise me. If people are really happy, they love what they do, they will go the extra mile. And what you'll get from this as well is a level of confidence that permeates from people. They'll see people around them radiating energy, radiating positive energy. That creates confidence. It creates a can-do environment. Not a surprise to me at all that comes up. If you've got a happy environment, people love what they do, of course they're more productive. Of course you have a brilliant business. You have great people working for you who are entirely engaged. You have a world-beating company. That, I think, is entirely true.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because rarely I've heard in my recruitment life, when things aren't going quite so well from a performance point of view, rarely is the answer put forward, but how can I make my people happier? How can I make my people more engaged? It's always back down to the performance of how the KPIs, CVs out, meeting more people, getting more on LinkedIn, more producing more content, all the practical things that we know that makes our recruitment business tick over. But rarely do we ever say, actually, performance was really poor last month. How can I make my people happier this month? Because the happier bit can take a bit longer and the performance is more today. But actually, the more engaged companies have a happier workforce, as we've already discussed. So therefore, if you can begin to work on that, but I don't think that many employers know whether their people are happy or not. And I dare say some of them don't really care, because I don't really care whether they're happy, as long as they're performing and they're earning well, that's it. As if that's the answer.
It's interesting, isn't it? Although you say poor people blank out the worst parts of recruitment, I'm sort of one of those people that sort of have a look at the worst parts and say, right, how do I improve that? And I remember going through a stage where I was hugely above target, and I went through a stage where I think I had almost 50 interviews on the trot, and everyone dropped, everyone failed, didn't get one placement. And my boss was giving me an absolutely torrid time on my performance, and giving me a really torrid time on my performance. And it was really stressing me out, and it was really getting quite on my nerves to a certain degree, that it was probably blocking my performance. And it was really funny is that the MD of the company just took me to one side and said, look, what you're doing is absolutely right. You're not doing anything wrong. Just keep doing what you're doing. She's just stupid. And I was thinking, so here's my boss's boss looking after me, but my actual boss was giving me an absolute hurls of abuse. And then all of a sudden, the dam broke, and I think I hit 10 out of 10 interviews hit. And then over the next 3 months, when you looked at my ratios were back to normal, and I was, still miles above target. But it was those words, because I was on the verge of just telling this person where to go forth and multiply and walk out, because of the way she made me feel. And I think that, to me, is another thing that managers, leaders, owners, etc., need to understand, that the way they make people feel has a direct correlation on their performance. So if you make people feel less about themselves, then they're not going to perform. But if you make people feel more about themselves and more empowered about themselves, then they'll start to grow and start to develop. And that, to me, is when you start to look at performance and well-being, and that's when it starts to come together and you work well. So the question that we first posed was performance versus well-being. Is it possible to have both?
And the answer to that is not only yes, but it's vital. is absolutely vital to make sure in this day and age that you have a real grasp on how people are feeling in your business. And as I've already said, I think this is not just about how they feel about the business and their daily job, but how they are in their lives. We should be interested in understanding not just what they're feeling about their work environment, but also being supportive and encouraging towards them in relation to what's going on outside of work. And I say there is a line. You can't be too nosy or too intrusive, but showing an authentic interest in a human being is vital. And I use the word authentic. You can't fake authenticity. You've got to be genuinely interested in that individual. That shouldn't be difficult for us. We are people. We are generally very interested in human beings. I think it requires more effort to get to know your people and really understand what makes them tick. Befriend them, if that's the expression. Make sure they feel engaged with you and everybody around them. And if you can manage that, and there's no reason why you can't, you could have a very happy and productive employee for many, many, many years. The other last thing I would add to this point, which I haven't said, but it's really important, is make sure consistently on a daily basis, as a mantra, I can always use that expression, you're talking about the vision of the business. Where is it going? Where's the company going in the next 2-3 years? And what will that mean to the individuals that work for you? How will they benefit? How will it improve their careers and their personal lives? And that, again, is something that's really important to consistently discuss so that people can see there's a future for them in the company.
Dave, very quickly.
Yeah, obviously, if you have the well-being and the culture right, then you are more than likely to get the performance. You're more than likely to get people engaged. They're more than likely to stay, and then that circle continues out, and you end up with a stronger company.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. That to me, that well-being drives performance. Performance doesn't drive well-being. And I think there's a correlation there that we've got to start to think well-being first, performance then will come from that. But if you just drive performance, then you're going to create an unhealthy culture, which then drives all the things that we know that goes from there. So it's possible to have both, but it depends which way you run them both. And this sort of leads into sort of next week's conversation, which I think is a really interesting conversation. It's the great working from home experiment. We're going to find out how it's worked. Has it worked? There's so many companies who've gone, yes, we're going to go 100% working from home. Then there's hybrid. Then there's back into the office. Well, next week's discussion, we're going to look at, working from home. How do we create a culture from that type of environment, etc.? Do we need to offer and attract the right talent? Can we create a dynamic full culture, etc.? And I think whether it's working from home or whether it's working in the office, creating that culture is really important. But having that element where it's a disparate office is a very different element and something that we should look at. So that's what we're going to look at next week, guys. So thanks very much for your time. Thanks for everybody who's attended. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Dave and Paul, enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll speak to you all later on.
Bye, everybody. Take good care.
Yeah, everybody have a good week. Thank you.
See you soon.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody. Bye.